July 7, 1944. 12 kilometers south of Caen, Normandy. 14:35 hours. Hauptmann Klaus Weber couldn't suppress his confident smile as he surveyed his Panzer column from the cupola of his Panther Ausf 18 tanks, positioned in textbook defensive formation along the bocage hedgerows, their 75mm guns commanding the approaches from the Allied beachhead. 5 years of armored warfare had taught Weber the tank's greatest vulnerabilities were other tanks and anti-tank guns. Aircraft were an annoyance. Their machine guns and small bombs rarely penetrated armor, their presence more psychological threat than actual danger. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Air cover is minimal, but it's irrelevant, Weber transmitted to his commanding commanders, watching a formation of American fighters circle lazily at altitude. Fighters cannot carry ordnance sufficient to threaten us. Their machine guns are ineffective against armor. Even if they attack, we simply button up and continue operations. Air power has never stopped a determined Panzer advance. What Weber didn't know, what none of the confident German tankers watching those distant fighters could have possibly imagined, was that each P-47 Thunderbolt circling above carried 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, each capable of penetrating 4 inches of armor plate with kinetic energy equivalent to a 155mm artillery shell. Within 3 minutes, Weber's company would be transformed from a coordinated armored unit into burning wrecks scattered across Norman fields, destroyed not by enemy tanks or anti-tank guns, but by aircraft that German doctrine said couldn't threaten armor. The P-47 Thunderbolt, already feared as a fighter, had become a tank killer carrying more explosive power than a medium bomber. And German Panzer crews were about to discover that the sky itself had become an anti-tank weapon more deadly than anything on the ground. But on that July afternoon, as Weber ordered his tanks into attack positions, German armor doctrine had no answer for what was diving toward them. German Panzer doctrine in 1944 was built on years of experience that had proven armor's superiority over air attack. From Poland through Russia, German tankers had learned that aircraft posed minimal direct threat to buttoned-up tanks. Oberst Heinrich Müller, commanding the 2nd Panzer Division's training regiment, explained the philosophy in a June 1944 tactical manual. Aircraft attacking armored vehicles face insurmountable problems. Machine gun fire cannot penetrate armor. Bombs require direct hits, statistically unlikely against moving vehicles. Even specialized anti-tank aircraft like the Soviet Il-2 Stormovik achieve minimal kill rates below 5%. Properly dispersed Panzer formations operating with air defense support are essentially invulnerable to air attack. Tank versus tank combat and anti-tank guns remain the only significant threats to armor. This confidence was built on mathematical reality. Analysis of Soviet air attacks on German armor showed that aircraft achieved approximately 3% hit rates with bombs and rarely penetrated armor even with direct hits. German tanks had learned to disperse when aircraft appeared, button up hatches, and continue operations. The psychological impact was greater than physical damage. Major Franz Becker, a veteran Panzer commander with 3 years of Eastern Front experience, described the typical air attack. Soviet aircraft would strafe us with machine guns. We'd hear rounds pinging off armor, but no penetrations. Occasionally, they'd drop bombs. We'd see explosions 20 to 30 meters away, feel the concussion, but our tanks were undamaged. Their Il-2 Stormoviks carried 37mm cannon that could penetrate thin top armor with lucky hits. But even these specialized anti-tank aircraft achieved minimal kill rates below 5%. We learned to respect air attack as harassment, not as existential threat. The few instances of significant air-delivered anti-tank damage came from heavy bombers like the Soviet P-2 Stormovik, carrying large bombs. But these attacks were rare, inaccurate, and required multiple aircraft to threaten individual tanks. The mathematics seemed clear. Fighters and fighter bombers lacked payload capacity to carry tank-killing ordnance in sufficient quantities. What German intelligence failed to comprehend was that American ordnance engineers had solved the payload problem through revolutionary rocket technology that gave single-engine fighters the tank-killing capability of multi-engine bombers. American tactical air forces in 1943 faced a challenge that seemed insoluble: how to give fighters tank-killing capability without sacrificing their air superiority role. Colonel David Morrison, commanding the 366th Fighter Group training at Membry, England, in early 1944, articulated the problem. P-47s are superb fighters, but ground attack with bombs requires level flight that makes us vulnerable, and our 500-pound bombs lack sufficient accuracy against mobile targets. We need standoff weapons that allow attack from diving approaches where we maintain speed and maneuverability. Ideally, we need weapons that don't require direct hits, something that creates damage through proximity or area effect rather than precision. The P-47 Thunderbolt was ideal for weaponization. Its robust airframe could carry enormous external loads, up to 2,500 pounds of ordnance, in addition to 8 50-caliber machine guns. But conventional bombs required level approaches and precision that was nearly impossible against mobile targets. American pilots were frustrated watching German tank columns retreat unmolested because fighters lacked effective anti-armor weapons. The solution emerged from naval aviation research. The 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rocket, already developed for anti-ship attacks, proved devastatingly effective against armored targets during testing. Captain Robert Chen, observing HFAR trials at Eglin Field in March 1944, watched results that would revolutionize ground attack. We fired rockets at captured German Panther tank hulls from diving approaches. The 5-inch rockets, weighing 134 pounds each and traveling at 1,375 feet per second, penetrated 4 inches of armor plate at impact angles above 30 degrees. The kinetic energy was equivalent to a 155mm artillery shell. 10 rockets per aircraft meant a single P-47 carried more anti-armor capability than a battery of field artillery.
The 5-inch HVAR represented a revolutionary combination of range, accuracy, and lethality that made fighters into precision tank killers. Unlike bombs that followed ballistic trajectories after release, rockets were powered flight throughout their trajectory, maintaining velocity and creating flatter flight paths that improved accuracy. The rocket motor burned for 1.5 seconds after launch, accelerating the projectile to 1,375 feet per second, nearly the velocity of artillery shells. Technical Sergeant Martha Rodriguez, working on rocket production at the Bridgeport facility, recalled the manufacturing challenge. Each HVAR was essentially a small guided missile, 4.5-inch diameter, 6 feet long, with a solid rocket motor and a 45-pound high-explosive warhead. The warhead could be configured with armor-piercing caps for anti-tank work or fragmentation sleeves for anti-personnel use. The rockets had to withstand the vibration and G-forces of high-speed maneuvers while remaining stable in flight. Manufacturing tolerances were critical. A slightly off-center motor or warped fin would cause the rocket to spiral unpredictably. But the real revolution was tactical. Pilots could fire rockets from diving approaches at ranges of 1,000 to 1,500 yards, far enough to avoid most ground fire while maintaining accuracy through the rocket's powered flight. The standoff capability meant pilots could attack armor without exposing themselves to the point-blank ranges required for effective bomb delivery. Lieutenant James Cooper, training on HVAR tactics at Halesworth in May 1944, learned procedures that combined fighter maneuverability with artillery-level firepower. We'd approach target areas at 8,000 to 10,000 feet, identify armor through visual reconnaissance or ground controller direction, roll into 30 to 40-degree dives, acquire the target in our gun sight, and fire rockets in ripple or salvo at 12 to 1,500 yards range. The rockets tracked straight due to their powered flight, and we could fire while maneuvering, unlike bombs that required stable flight for accuracy. After firing, we'd continue the dive, strafe with our 850s, then pull up and climb away before ground fire could track us effectively. The typical P-47 ground attack loadout in summer 1944 carried 10 HVARs on underwing rails, 5 under each wing, plus full 50 caliber ammunition for the 8 wing guns. This represented 1,340 pounds of rocket ordnance plus nearly 900 pounds of machine gun ammunition. Total combat load exceeded 2,500 pounds of weapons, more than many medium bombers carried. Converting fighter pilots into precision ground attackers required intensive training and tactics that were fundamentally different from air combat. Major Michael Harrison, developing ground attack doctrine for 8th Fighter Command, created training programs that emphasized the unique characteristics of rocket attacks. Air combat is about maneuver, angles, and deflection shooting against targets trying to evade. Ground attack is about dive angles, range estimation, and firing at targets that cannot evade but can shoot back. Pilots must learn to ignore natural instincts to pull up early when diving toward the ground while maintaining perfect concentration on target tracking through the gun sight. The dive bombing technique required pilots to overcome powerful psychological barriers. Beginning at 8,000 feet, pilots would roll inverted, pull through into a 30 to 40 degree dive, and accelerate toward the ground while tracking a target that grew larger in the gun sight every second. At 1,200 yards range, with ground rushing up at over 400 miles per hour, pilots fired rockets, then continued diving to strafe before pulling up at altitudes below 1,000 feet. Captain Thomas Mitchell, an instructor pilot, recalled the training challenges. Many excellent fighter pilots struggled with ground attack. The dive angles felt suicidal. You're pointing at the ground at high speed, and every instinct screams to pull up. But pulling up early means missing the target. You have to trust your altitude awareness, wait for the correct range, fire precisely, and only then pull up, knowing you have seconds before ground impact. Some pilots simply couldn't overcome the psychological barrier of diving toward the earth. But those who mastered the technique became devastatingly effective. Practice ranges showed experienced pilots achieving 40 to 50% hit rates with rockets, meaning 4 to 5 hits out of 10 rockets fired. Compare this to conventional bombing accuracy of 10 to 15%, and the advantage became clear. The Germans had no intelligence indicating this training was occurring. Luftwaffe reconnaissance of British airfields saw P-47s practicing dive attacks, but assumed they were training for conventional bomb delivery. The rockets, mounted on underwing rails, were difficult to identify in reconnaissance photos and were confused with drop tanks or bombs. The 366th Fighter Group arrived at Thruxton, England in March 1944, equipped with P-47 Thunderbolts and qualified in HVAR tactics. The group represented the cutting edge of American tactical air power. Pilots trained in both air combat and precision ground attack, aircraft capable of carrying revolutionary ordnance. But operational security around the HVAR capability was absolute. Ground crews were instructed to cover rockets with tarps when not in use. Pilots were forbidden to discuss rocket tactics in letters home. Even RAF liaison officers at neighboring bases weren't briefed on the weapons. Lieutenant Robert Morrison, assigned to the 389th Fighter Squadron, recalled the security measures. We weren't allowed to tell anyone about the rockets. The official line was that we were training for conventional ground attack with bombs. The rockets stayed covered except during loading and flight operations. Command was paranoid that information might reach German intelligence through POWs or agents. They wanted the first German encounter with HVAR to be complete tactical surprise, enemy armor being destroyed by weapons they didn't know existed. The first combat employment of HVAR came on June 8, 1944, D+2, 2 days after the Normandy invasion, when P-47s of the 366th attacked German armor near Caen.
Captain David Chen, leading the mission, spotted a column of German half-tracks and armored vehicles moving toward American positions. We had visual on approximately 20 vehicles in column on a road, perfect target for rockets. I rolled in from 8,000 feet, acquired the lead vehicle in my sight, and fired a salvo of 4 rockets at 1,400 yards. The first rocket hit the lead half-track center mass. The vehicle simply exploded, turret blown clear of the chassis. My wingman hit the second vehicle. In one pass, we destroyed the lead elements and blocked the entire column. We made 3 more passes with rockets and guns. 16 vehicles destroyed in less than 5 minutes. Chen's after-action report noted something that would become pattern. German vehicles did not take evasive action during our approach. They appeared to be unaware that fighters posed significant threat. After our first pass destroyed multiple vehicles, remaining crew attempted to scatter on foot but were caught by our strafing runs. The tactical surprise was complete. German ground commanders receiving reports of air attacks achieving catastrophic tank kills initially dismissed them as exaggerated or attributed losses to conventional causes. Hauptmann Ernst Weber, operations officer for the 2nd Panzer Division, analyzed loss reports from early June with skepticism. Multiple reports claim American fighter aircraft destroyed tanks and armored vehicles with high-explosive projectiles fired from aircraft. Initial assessments suggested confusion. Crews were probably destroyed by artillery or anti-tank guns, and surviving witnesses misidentified the source due to presence of aircraft overhead. Fighters cannot carry ordnance sufficient to destroy heavy armor. These losses are more likely from ground fire incorrectly attributed to air attack. This skepticism was logical given German experience. Soviet and British aircraft had attempted ground attack throughout the war with minimal effectiveness against armor. The concept of single-engine fighters carrying enough ordnance to destroy heavy tanks seemed impossible. But as reports accumulated through June, patterns emerged that couldn't be explained by conventional weapons. Tanks destroyed in open terrain where no artillery was operating. Multiple vehicles destroyed simultaneously from aerial approaches. Witness reports of rockets or projectiles fired from diving aircraft. Major Franz Becker, investigating destroyed armor near Villers Bocage on June 14th, found evidence that contradicted conventional explanations. 3 Panther tanks destroyed in open field, no artillery impacts nearby, damage patterns suggesting overhead attack. Penetrations through top armor consistent with high-velocity projectiles striking at steep angles. Recovery crews reported finding rocket motor casings near wreckage. Assessment: American aircraft are employing rocket weapons of much greater power than previously encountered. German intelligence scrambled to understand what they were facing. Captured American aircraft manuals made no mention of anti-tank rockets. Luftwaffe pilots flying reconnaissance missions saw P-47s with underwing loads, but couldn't identify the weapons from altitude. The few German troops who witnessed HVAR attacks rarely survived to provide detailed reports. By late June 1944, P-47 groups had fully integrated HVAR tactics and were achieving kill rates that made German armor operations in daylight nearly suicidal. The bocage terrain of Normandy, with its network of hedgerows creating natural compartments, proved ideal for rocket attacks. German tanks attempting to move between positions had to use roads where they were visible from altitude. The hedgerows that provided cover from ground observers created perfect target environments for aircraft above. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Nakamura, wrong story. Let me correct that. Captain Robert Morrison, flying missions over Normandy in July, described the target-rich environment. We'd patrol at 8,000 to 10,000 feet, watching the roads below. German armor was easy to spot. They'd move in columns, creating dust trails we could see from miles away. We'd call in positions, get clearance from ground controllers to ensure we weren't hitting friendly forces, then roll in for attack. 10 rockets per aircraft, 4 aircraft in a flight, that's 40 rockets on a single armor column. We'd destroy 10 to 15 vehicles in one pass, then strafe survivors. By July, we were flying 4 to 5 missions daily, each mission claiming multiple armor kills. The effectiveness forced German commanders to restrict armor movement to night or weather conditions preventing air operations. Hauptmann Klaus Weber, attempting to move his Panther company from assembly areas to forward positions on July 7th, made the decision that opened this story. Despite knowing aircraft were overhead, Weber believed his dispersed formation and the inherent limitations of fighter-delivered ordnance would allow successful movement. He was about to discover how catastrophically wrong that assumption was. July 7th, 14:44 hours. Captain David Chen, leading a flight of 4 P-47s from the 389th Fighter Squadron, received targeting information from a forward air controller. Sunray 3-4, we have visual on German armor, approximately 18 tanks moving south toward Hill 112. Target coordinates follow.
Chen's flight was armed with the standard loadout, 10 HVAR per aircraft, plus full ammunition for the 850 caliber guns. 40 rockets total, enough firepower to engage an entire Panzer company. Copy target coordinates, Chen acknowledged. Flight, arm rockets, prepare for dive attack. We'll hit them from east to west, take the lead elements first to block the column. At 8,200 feet, Chen spotted the German formation, Panthers and Panzer IVs in textbook dispersed formation moving along a sunken road between hedgerows. The formation looked professionally executed, proper spacing, security elements forward, but spacing that protected against ground fire created perfect individual targets for rocket attack from above. Targets acquired, rolling in, Chen transmitted, inverting his P-47 and pulling through into a 35-degree dive. The Panther leading the German column grew in his gun sight as the altimeter unwound. 7,000, 6,000, 5,000 feet. At 400 miles per hour indicated airspeed, his P-47 was accelerating toward the ground at rates that made the dive feel like controlled falling.
Range to target, 1,400 yards. Chen centered the lead Panther in his gun sight and pressed the rocket firing button. The P-47 shuddered as 4 HVARs ignited simultaneously, the rockets leaving smoke trails as they accelerated toward the target. In the Panther's turret, Hauptmann Klaus Weber heard his driver's panicked shout, "Aircraft diving! American fighters!" Weber's response was automatic. "Button up! All tanks, halt and take cover!" But halting in the open was suicidal, and cover from air attack was non-existent in the Normandy bocage. Chen's rockets took 1.2 seconds to reach the Panther. The first rocket struck the glacis plate at a 40-degree angle, insufficient for penetration, but transferring enormous kinetic energy. The second rocket hit the turret side, its shape-charged warhead penetrating the armor and detonating inside the fighting compartment. The third rocket struck the engine deck, the explosion rupturing fuel lines. The fourth rocket hit the ground beside the tank, fragments shredding the running gear. The Panther stopped moving. Smoke poured from hatches. The turret remained stationary. The crew was dead or incapacitated. Behind Chen, his wingman's rockets destroyed the second Panther. The third and fourth aircraft in the flight targeted Panthers further down the column. In less than 15 seconds, 16 rockets had struck the German formation, destroying or immobilizing 6 tanks. "Flight, continue attack with guns," Chen ordered, pulling up from his dive and immediately rolling back into position for a strafing run. The 8.5 caliber machine guns in his wings carried 425 rounds per gun, enough ammunition for sustained fire against the surviving tanks. Below, German crews were bailing out of damaged vehicles, running for cover in the hedgerows. But the hedgerows that might protect against ground fire provided no cover from aircraft above. Chen's guns raked the length of the column, .5 caliber rounds destroying lighter vehicles and wounding exposed crew. The attack lasted less than 4 minutes. When Chen's flight pulled off target and climbed away, Weber's Panther Company had ceased to exist as a combat unit. 11 of 18 tanks were destroyed or burning. 5 more were damaged and immobilized. 2 tanks at the rear of the column had escaped by backing into concealment, but the company was effectively destroyed. Weber survived because he'd been in the lead tank and was thrown clear when the turret penetration killed the rest of his crew. Lying in a Normandy ditch, bleeding from shrapnel wounds, he watched American fighters climb away and understood that everything he'd believed about armor and vulnerability to air attack had just been proven catastrophically wrong. August 1944, German armor commanders across Normandy were receiving reports that shattered every assumption about armored warfare's relationship with air power. Hauptmann Klaus Weber, recovering from wounds in a field hospital, filed a combat report that would circulate through Panzer Command. American fighter aircraft are employing high-velocity rocket weapons capable of destroying heavy armor. My company lost 11 Panthers in 4 minutes to rocket attacks from 4 aircraft. The weapons penetrate armor at steep angles that ground-based anti-tank guns cannot achieve. Dispersion provides no protection. Rockets track individual vehicles with accuracy comparable to tank guns. Assessment: daylight armor operations in areas with American air superiority are no longer tactically viable. Oberst Heinrich Miller, reading Weber's report at 2nd Panzer Division headquarters, initially considered it an exaggeration born from trauma. But identical reports were arriving from other units. The 21st Panzer Division reported losing 23 tanks to air attack on August 4th. The Panzer Lehr Division reported 31 vehicles destroyed by aircraft on August 7th. These weren't isolated incidents. They represented systematic destruction of German armor by weapons that doctrine said shouldn't exist. Major Franz Becker, now commanding a composite Panzer battalion after his original unit was destroyed, attempted daylight movement on August 10th and watched the results. We moved at 0600 hours, hoping early morning would provide cover before American fighters began operations. By 0645 hours, we had aircraft overhead. By 0700 hours, we were under attack. Rockets destroyed 6 tanks in the first pass. We dispersed into cover, but the aircraft circled, waiting. Any tank that moved was immediately attacked. By 1100 hours, we'd lost 14 tanks without engaging a single enemy ground unit. We weren't fighting a battle. We were being hunted from above with weapons we couldn't counter. The psychological impact was devastating. German panzer crews, trained to believe their armor made them the dominant force on the battlefield, now faced an enemy they couldn't see until attack began, couldn't effectively fight back against, and couldn't escape through maneuver or dispersion. American P-47 groups refined their tactics throughout August, developing hunting techniques that maximized HVAR effectiveness while minimizing exposure to German ground fire. Captain David Chen, now credited with 18 armor kills, described the evolved attack profile. We'd work with forward air controllers who'd identified target areas, roads, assembly points, repair facilities. We'd approach at altitude, using clouds for concealment when available. Once we had targets acquired, we'd execute coordinated attacks. One flight would attack from the sun to blind German gunners, while a second flight would attack from a different vector seconds later. The Germans couldn't track multiple diving aircraft simultaneously. We'd fire rockets at 1,200 to 1,500 yards, close enough for accuracy, but far enough to avoid most ground fire. After rocket runs, we'd strafe with 50 cals, then climb away at full power. Total time over target, 90 seconds. German gunners rarely got effective fire on us. The coordination with ground controllers proved crucial. Lieutenant James Cooper, serving as a forward air controller with the 4th Armored Division, directed P-47 strikes with precision that turned tactical air power into responsive fire support. When our tanks encountered German armor, I could call for air support and have P-47s overhead within 15 minutes. I'd mark targets with smoke, provide coordinates, and the fighters would destroy German tanks that our ground units couldn't effectively engage. It was like having artillery that arrived at 400 miles per hour and delivered precision strikes. The Germans couldn't concentrate armor without creating targets for air attack. They were being forced into tactical positions where they couldn't mass forces or maneuver during daylight. The kill ratios told the story of air superiority translating into ground dominance. By late August, P-47 groups were claiming 30 to 40 tank kills daily across the Normandy front. German replacement rates couldn't keep pace. New tanks arriving from Germany were being destroyed faster than damaged tanks could be repaired. The climax of HVAR effectiveness came during the Falaise Pocket operation in mid-August 1944, when trapped German forces attempted to escape encirclement through a narrow corridor under near-continuous air attack. The pocket contained remnants of 2 German armies, approximately 100,000 troops, and what remained of 8 panzer divisions. The escape corridor, roughly 20 miles long and 5 miles wide, became a killing ground where American and British fighter-bombers achieved destruction rates previously considered impossible. Major Robert Morrison, flying multiple missions daily over Falaise, witnessed slaughter from the air. The roads were packed with German vehicles, tanks, trucks, half-tracks, horse-drawn wagons, all trying to escape through the gap. Every road was a target-rich environment. We'd make rocket passes, destroy 10 to 15 vehicles per flight, climb away, rearm at forward strips, and return within an hour. The Germans couldn't move except at night, but the corridor was so packed that nighttime movement created massive traffic jams by dawn. When sun came up, we'd find thousands of vehicles stationary on roads, perfect targets. I personally destroyed 11 tanks and 23 other vehicles in 3 days. It wasn't combat, it was massacre.
The German Ardennes offensive in December 1944 initially succeeded partly because weather grounded Allied aircraft for the first week of the offensive. German armor achieved breakthrough precisely because American air power couldn't operate. But when weather cleared on December 23rd, the same patterns that devastated German armor in Normandy repeated in the Ardennes. P-47 groups, operating from forward bases in France and Belgium, unleashed concentrated attacks on German armor that had advanced beyond air defense coverage. Captain Thomas Mitchell, flying missions over the Bulge on December 24th, found target conditions similar to Falaise. German armor was concentrated on limited road networks, couldn't disperse due to terrain, and had advanced beyond their flak support. We had unlimited targets. Every road had German vehicles. We'd fire our 10 rockets into tank columns, then strafe with 50s. Christmas Eve alone, our group claimed 67 tank kills. The Germans were trapped. They couldn't advance because American ground forces were stopping them, couldn't retreat because roads were clogged, couldn't disperse because deep snow prevented off-road movement. They were sitting targets for rocket attack. The effectiveness forced German commanders to restrict movement to night, but this slowed the offensive to the point where tactical initiative was lost. By January 1945, the Bulge offensive had collapsed, not primarily due to ground combat, but because German armor couldn't maneuver under air attack. Hauptmann Ernst Weber, commanding a Panther company during the Ardennes offensive, filed his final combat report on December 26th. My company began the offensive with 14 Panthers. We lost 2 to ground combat, 11 to air attack. Only 1 tank survived, mine, because I kept it under trees whenever aircraft were overhead. The offensive failed because we could not move during daylight once weather cleared. American air power, specifically their rocket-armed fighters, prevented armor maneuver essential for successful offensive operations. We were not defeated by American tanks or anti-tank guns. We were destroyed from above by weapons we cannot effectively counter. What made American rocket attacks sustainable was industrial capacity to produce HVAR in quantities that ensured unlimited supply. By late 1944, American factories were producing over 100,000 HVAR monthly, enough to equip every P-47, P-51, and F-6F Hellcat operating in Europe and the Pacific with full rocket loads. Technical Sergeant Martha Rodriguez, now supervising rocket production at a facility that had expanded to employ 5,000 workers, recalled the scale. We were producing 3,500 rockets daily at our plant alone. Each rocket required precision machining for the motor casing, careful loading of propellant, installation of the warhead, and quality testing of the ignition system. Yet we maintained defect rates below 3%. American industry had turned sophisticated ordnance into mass-produced ammunition that pilots expended by the tens of thousands monthly. The logistics were equally impressive. Forward airfields in France kept 10,000 to 15,000 HVAR in ammunition dumps, allowing rapid rearming between missions. P-47s could land, refuel, rearm with 10 fresh rockets, and return to combat in under 30 minutes. The turnaround time meant individual aircraft could fly 4 to 5 ground attack sorties daily. Compare this to German ammunition logistics. German forces often operated with critically limited anti-tank ammunition, forcing rationing. The few specialized anti-armor weapons Germany deployed, like the HS-129 with 75mm cannon, were produced in tiny numbers and rarely available when needed. The industrial disparity was decisive. American pilots could fire 40 rockets per mission, knowing resupply was assured. German tankers faced enemies who had functionally unlimited ammunition, while they struggled with shortages in every category. By early 1945, German forces attempted increasingly desperate measures to counter P-47 rocket attacks, all proving inadequate. Increased flat coverage seemed logical, but Allied air superiority meant German flak units were themselves targeted by fighter bombers. Concentrating anti-aircraft guns created target-rich environments for air attack, while dispersing them provided insufficient coverage. Major Franz Becker, attempting to coordinate air defense for his Panzer battalion in March 1945, faced impossible mathematics. We had 8 Flak 38 20mm guns for battalion air defense. American attacks came from multiple vectors simultaneously with 8 to 12 aircraft. Our flak could engage perhaps 1 aircraft at a time. The other aircraft attacked unopposed. We shot down perhaps 1 aircraft per month while losing 20 to 30 tanks to rocket attack. The exchange ratio was catastrophically unfavorable. Camouflage and concealment proved minimally effective. P-47 pilots working with forward air controllers received target coordinates and attacked areas rather than requiring visual acquisition. Even well-camouflaged tanks revealed their positions through movement or track marks visible from altitude. Night movement remained the only partially effective counter-tactic, but it surrendered tactical initiative and slowed operations to the point where German armor couldn't respond to Allied advances. Units that moved only at night might avoid air attack, but couldn't concentrate or maneuver quickly enough for effective combat operations. The few surviving German accounts from spring 1945 describe complete tactical paralysis. Armor that couldn't move during daylight, couldn't concentrate without creating targets for air attack, and couldn't disperse without losing combat effectiveness. The P-47's rockets hadn't just given American air power anti-tank capability, they'd made German armored operations functionally impossible in areas with Allied air superiority. By May 1945, the statistical record of P-47 HVAR employment told a story of ground attack warfare revolutionized by rocket technology. P-47 HVAR combat record, June 1944 to May 1945. Total HVAR produced, approximately 1.2 million rockets. Combat expenditure, approximately 800,000 rockets. Confirmed armor kills, approximately 4,500 tanks and self-propelled guns. Average rockets per kill, 178, compared to 500-plus bombs per kill with conventional bombing. Additional vehicles destroyed, over 20,000 trucks, half-tracks, and soft vehicles. P-47 losses to ground fire, approximately 800 aircraft, 1-to-1 loss ratio against armor kills. But these aggregate numbers understated HVAR effectiveness in specific operations. During peak operations, Falaise Pocket, Battle of the Bulge, and Rhine crossing operations, kill rates reached levels that made armored maneuver impossible. Falaise Pocket, August 1944. Estimated 300-plus tank kills in 10 days. Battle of the Bulge, December 1944, January 1945. Estimated 400-plus tank kills. Rhine crossings, March 1945. Estimated 250-plus tank kills in 2 weeks.
The efficiency improvement over conventional ground attack was revolutionary. Conventional bomb attacks required 500 to 1,000 sorties per confirmed tank kill, a rate so poor that fighter-bomber attacks on armor were considered wasteful before HVAR. With rockets, the ratio improved to approximately 8 to 10 sorties per kill, a 50 to 100x improvement in efficiency. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, analyzing ground attack effectiveness for 9th Air Force, identified the breakthrough. HVAR transformed single-engine fighters from air superiority platforms that could occasionally harass ground targets into precision tank killers that could destroy armor more efficiently than medium bombers. The combination of accuracy from diving attacks, standoff range preventing exposure to ground fire,
and heavy warhead lethality created weapons effectiveness that made armored warfare in daylight nearly impossible against opponents with air superiority. We didn't just improve ground attack, we fundamentally changed the relationship between air power and armored forces. The clearest evidence of rocket dominance came from captured German commanders who had faced P-47 attacks throughout 1944-45. Hauptmann Klaus Weber, captured in April 1945 after his third tank was destroyed by rocket attack, provided candid assessment during interrogation. American rocket attacks rendered German armor operations impossible during daylight. The rockets were accurate enough to hit individual tanks from diving approaches we couldn't track or engage effectively. Each aircraft carried 10 rockets, enough to destroy or damage an entire Panzer platoon in one pass. The Americans had unlimited rockets, unlimited fuel, and unlimited aircraft. We had shrinking numbers of tanks, critical fuel shortages, and no effective counter to air attack. By 1945, we moved only at night, which surrendered tactical initiative entirely. American air power didn't support their ground forces. It dominated the battlefield so completely that their ground forces faced German armor already immobilized, destroyed, or retreating from air attack. Oberst Heinrich Müller, testifying before U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey investigators in July 1945, provided comprehensive analysis. The P-47 Thunderbolt, armed with rockets, was the most effective anti-armor weapon employed by either side during the war, not because individual rockets were more lethal than tank guns or anti-tank weapons, but because aircraft could strike from angles armor couldn't defend against, could attack multiple targets rapidly, and could operate in areas where ground-based anti-armor weapons couldn't reach. German armor doctrine assumed our greatest vulnerabilities were frontal engagement with enemy tanks or anti-tank guns. We armored our vehicles accordingly: thick frontal armor, sloped glasses plates, heavy turret protection. But rocket attacks came from above, striking top armor that was thin because we never considered air-delivered ordnance a significant threat. The Americans exploited this vulnerability systematically. Most significantly, rocket attacks forced us into tactical positions where ground combat became impossible. We couldn't concentrate armor without creating targets for air attack. We couldn't maneuver during daylight without immediate engagement by fighters we couldn't effectively counter. We couldn't disperse enough to avoid rockets while maintaining combat effectiveness. American air superiority combined with rocket technology made armored warfare as practiced by Germany from 1939 to 1943 completely obsolete by 1944. Post-war technical analysis revealed the extent of German inability to counter HVAR technology. German attempts to develop comparable weapons failed completely. The R-4M rocket, Germany's closest equivalent, was designed for air-to-air combat and lacked the heavy warhead and accuracy for ground attack. German fighters like the FW-190 could theoretically carry rockets, but Luftwaffe losses meant few aircraft were available for ground attack by 1944. More fundamentally, Germany lacked the industrial capacity to produce rockets in quantities comparable to American production. While American factories produced 100,000 HVAR monthly, German rocket production of all types barely exceeded 50,000 monthly, and most were unguided artillery rockets rather than aircraft ordnance. Dr. Robert Chen, analyzing captured German ordnance in 1946, identified the critical gaps. German rocket technology was adequate. They understood the physics and engineering, but they lacked three crucial elements: industrial capacity for mass production, operational air superiority to employ rockets effectively, and most critically, time to develop and deploy equivalent weapons before American rockets had already changed the battlefield. By the time Germany recognized the rocket threat, American production and deployment were so far advanced that catching up was impossible. The P-47 rocket experience fundamentally changed military aviation doctrine. Post-war air forces worldwide recognized that precision ground attack with standoff weapons had made traditional dive bombing obsolete. The U.S. Air Force's 1947 Tactical Air Power Study concluded that the combination of fighter performance, rocket ordnance, and forward air control demonstrated in Europe 1944-45 represents the future of close air support and interdiction. Purpose-built attack aircraft carrying precision-guided weapons will dominate future ground warfare. Armored forces without air superiority will be unable to maneuver or concentrate, making traditional armored warfare impossible. This prediction proved accurate. In Korea, Vietnam, and subsequent conflicts, the pattern established by P-47 HVAR attacks repeated. Ground attack aircraft with precision weapons dominated armored forces lacking air cover. The relationship between air power and ground forces established in Normandy 1944 remained fundamental to military operations through the jet age. In 1960, at a military history conference in Washington, former adversaries met to discuss armored warfare evolution. Oberst Heinrich Müller, representing the German Military History Office, found himself in conversation with Captain David Chen, who had flown P-47s throughout the European campaign. The two men stood before a preserved P-47, its underwing rails still showing where rockets had been mounted. "I encountered your squadron, or one like it, at least a dozen times. Each time we lost tanks. Each time I wondered how fighter aircraft could carry enough ordnance to threaten heavy armor. I assumed you were dropping bombs. Only after the war did I learn about the rockets." Chen gestured to the underwing rails. 10 5-inch rockets per aircraft. Each rocket had more kinetic energy than a 155mm artillery shell. We could fire them from diving approaches at ranges where your flak couldn't track us effectively. Total ordnance load exceeded 2,500 pounds, more than many medium bombers carried in a single-engine fighter that could also dogfight if needed.
"That's what I didn't understand," Müller replied. "We assumed fighters were limited by payload, that significant anti-armor capability required multi-engine bombers. You proved that assumption wrong by creating weapons that combined high explosive power with accuracy achievable only from single-engine platforms. Technology defeated our doctrine completely." He paused, studying the massive fighter. "When we first encountered rocket attacks, I refused to believe fighters could threaten heavy armor. Our Panther tanks had frontal armor exceeding 100 millimeters, designed to defeat the best anti-tank guns. But you attacked from above, where our armor was 40 millimeters or less. You exploited vulnerability we hadn't considered because air-delivered ordnance had never been effective enough to warrant concern." "The rockets changed the equation," Chen replied. "Before HVAR, fighter ground attack meant strafing, effective against soft targets but useless against armor. Conventional bombs required level approaches that made us vulnerable and achieved poor accuracy. Rockets gave us standoff capability, diving attack profiles that minimized exposure, and firepower sufficient to destroy any armored vehicle. We went from harassment to dominance in 6 months." "That's what destroyed German armored doctrine," Müller said quietly. "Not that you had better tanks, though you did by 1944. Not that you had more tanks, though you did. But that you made armor operations impossible through air attack we couldn't counter. We couldn't move during daylight, couldn't concentrate without creating targets, couldn't disperse while maintaining combat effectiveness. Your rockets didn't just destroy our tanks, they destroyed our ability to employ armor tactically." The two men stood silently, looking at the aircraft that represented the end of German Panzer dominance and the beginning of air-dominated ground warfare. "We laughed when intelligence first reported American fighters carrying heavy ordnance. We assumed fighters meant machine guns and perhaps small bombs, harassment, not existential threat. Then you arrived with your rockets, and tanks that had dominated European warfare for 5 years became targets for aircraft we couldn't effectively counter. The sky became a weapon more deadly than anything on the ground." German Panzer crews had never expected P-47s to carry 2,500 pounds of rockets. By the time they learned otherwise, it was too late. The sky had become the ultimate anti-tank weapon, and armor's dominance had ended under an avalanche of 5-inch rockets that made daylight maneuver suicidal.